of those readings that kind of makes you want to add a question mark at the end of our response. Thanks be to God, question mark? Given the fact that we went rogue and swapped things up with the readings 2 weeks ago, I didn't feel like we could do it again this week, but man, after I read that gospel on Monday, was I tempted to. Jesus is clearly on one today. I feel like this would be perfect for one of those Snickers commercials. You know, the ones where they say, "You're not you when you're hungry." And then Simon Peter could hand Jesus a Snickers bar, and then he'd stop being hangry, hungry plus angry, and he'd get back to preaching the love your neighbor stuff that we're more used to. Because this really doesn't sound like the Jesus that we all know and love. I mean, wasn't he hailed as the Prince of Peace when he was born? So what's with the whole "you thought I came to bring peace on earth" thing? Also, apparently Jesus, like many stand-up comedians, has a problem with weather forecasters. He's talking trash about how people can predict the rain and the heat, but they can't read the signs of the present time. I wonder what he would have to say about our weather people here in San Diego, and how they have to find ways to make our very incremental shifts in weather seem interesting. You know how we go from 72 degrees all the way up to 74 degrees the next week? There is at least one saving grace in our reading for today, at least for anyone who recently got in a fight with a family member, because now you can just blame Jesus if you want to. I mean, he came to earth to set us against one another, right? Well, I just said that this doesn't sound like the Jesus that we all know and love, but that's not entirely accurate. I probably should have said, this doesn't sound like the parts of what Jesus said that we like to focus on. Because Jesus said a lot of things that were and still are pretty difficult to hear. We have this tendency to want to domesticate Jesus, to nicify him, to downplay some of the more radical and difficult parts of who he was and what he said. We like to focus on that image of Jesus as the good shepherd, where he's cuddling that one lost sheep and sitting on a rock in the middle of a grassy field. But this is the same guy who marched into the temple, turned over the tables of the money changers, and chased them out with a homemade whip. Both of those expressions of what it means to be the Son of God existed within him, and thus they both need to be reckoned with. I'm reminded of a conversation that takes place in the Chronicles of Narnia series, in the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Lucy, the youngest of the 4 siblings that have gone through the wardrobe, asks if Aslan the lion, who is an allegorical Jesus figure, she asks, is he safe? To which Mr. Beaver replies, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. He's a lion, but he is good. And the same is true for Jesus. No matter how much we want Jesus to be safe, to have his message and his mission be an easy one, it's just not always the case. A fact that is made crystal clear by our reading for today. But that being said, once we start digging into it, I promise you that this passage is not quite as scary as it might seem. For starters, the fire that Jesus speaks of is metaphorical. It's a way of describing the suffering that he will endure through his betrayal, the mockery of his trial, the rejection of the crowd, and ultimately his brutal death by crucifixion on the cross. He knows that it's coming, and part of him wishes that he could just get it over and done with. He says, "How I wish it were already ablaze." Fire has many different functions. It can help us cook, provide light, warmth, protection. It can also destroy, as we who live here in California know only too well. But that destruction isn't always bad. Fire is essential to the health of forests, clearing out the old dead undergrowth and enriching the soil with the nutrients that are needed for new life to spring up. There are actually some seeds that need the heat of a forest fire to signal that it is time for them to begin to grow. Fire clears out the old to make way for the new. And Jesus is talking about how his death and resurrection will act as a fire that will burn down the old, entrenched systems of this world that oppress and enslave, making room for a new way of being in the world, a way that is attuned to the values and the priorities of the kingdom of God. One of the commentaries that I read this week referred to a woman named Lisa Fithian. She's a grassroots activist, and whenever anyone asks her what she does for a living, her response is, "I create crisis, because crisis is that edge where change is possible." The author of the commentary relates what she said to what Jesus says in this passage, imagining that if Jesus hadn't spoken of fire, he could have said something along the lines of, "I have come to this world to bring crisis, because business as usual means injustice and death." Jesus is telling us that he has come to be a catalyst that will spark change. But that change will not be without some collateral damage. Jesus continues his fiery diatribe by saying, "Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division." And then he goes on to talk about setting mothers against daughters, fathers against sons, cats against dogs, and everyone against Dodgers fans. I didn't know you were coming today. Now, there's a big difference between Jesus saying something like, "My primary goal and purpose here on earth is to create division between you and your loved ones," and him saying, "By following me and living in this way that I am calling you to live, you might upset a few people, potentially even members of your own family." Now, to be clear, it's the second one that Jesus is actually saying. His goal isn't to spread discord or make our families any more dysfunctional than they already are. He's simply telling us that by being Christians, by being a follower of Christ, things won't always be easy. In fact, they will be downright difficult at times. There will be conflict and division, animosity and strife, but those aren't his intended goals. They are merely byproducts that will naturally occur as a result of living in such a radically different way, of valuing and prioritizing the rest of the world, valuing and prioritizing things that the rest of the world doesn't think are important. And that's actually a pretty consistent message with what we find throughout the rest of the Bible. In the scriptures, we see that living a life of faith doesn't mean that everything is going to be perfect or easy. In fact, it often is the opposite. And that's because faith doesn't inoculate us against suffering. Rather, it is that to which we cling in the midst of suffering. It's a reminder that no matter what we go through and we face, we do not face those hardships alone. As Adam Hamilton said in his book, Why?, which we used for an adult ed series here a few years ago, quote, "The Bible is not a promise that those who believe and do good will not suffer. Instead, the Bible is largely a book about people who refused to let go of their faith in the face of suffering." He goes on to say that the Bible definitely does not teach that those who follow God will have a life of bliss. It describes the dogged faith of those who continue to trust in God despite their suffering, and the comfort, strength, and hope that they find in the face of suffering. So even though following Jesus will probably cause some strife in our lives, it will also be that which helps us through that strife. It will unite some, and it will create vast chasms of division between others, between us and between those who are unwilling to live how he calls us to live, value what he calls us to value. So what are those morals and teachings that we are called to live by? The ones that might cause division and disagreement even amongst our own families? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Our first reading for today in Psalm 82, it clearly lays out many of the values that Jesus' ministry and mission are centered around. Verses 3 and 4 say, "Give justice to the weak and the orphan, maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked." We are called to work for justice in the world, seeking it not only for ourselves, but also for the weak and the vulnerable, for those who are without power or voice. We are called to rescue the weak and the needy from danger, to protect them from being exploited and harmed by the wicked, which means that we are called to provide physical, tangible help. Things like food resources, financial assistance, housing opportunities, because to be rescued means to be taken out of whatever perilous or dangerous situation you find yourself in and be delivered into safety. And yet, by adhering to those priorities, that will put us at odds with certain people. People who believe that you should pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. People who believe that you should provide for you and your family first, and then, only after you have secured your own well-being, if there's extra resources left over, be they tangible things like food, water, money, clothing, or intangible ones like love, support, advocacy, only if there's extra do we then offer those to others. And then there's some who would argue against even that, saying that if there's extra, you should save it up for a rainy day. But we'll get to that when we talk about building bigger barns in October. Jesus is calling us to a different way of living, to a way that prioritizes and takes care of the most vulnerable among us. And then verse 6 of the psalm says, "You are children of the Most High, all of you." This is something that both Pastor Laura and I try to mention in our sermons just about every week. The fact that we are all God's beloved children, that we were made in the image of God, that we bear a spark of the divine within us, and that we are recipients of God's amazing unconditional grace. And that can be a really awesome thing to hear, especially when it applies to us. To be reminded of our inherent worth and belovedness, amazing. But it can also be a hard thing to hear. Because if everyone is a beloved child of God, that means that even the people that annoy us, the people that we disagree with, the people that we downright despise and who despise us, they are also beloved children of God. I saw this meme online a few weeks ago, and Jesus says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And the person responds, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus says, "It's whoever you were hoping I wouldn't say." Cartoon Jesus pulling no punches. Living in that way that recognizes, values, honors the inherent worth of all people, no matter who they are, will put us at odds with certain people in the world. People who are obsessed with creating hierarchies, where some people are more valuable or better than others, which they do so that they can justify exploiting and manipulating others in order to achieve their own goals. Now, there are plenty of examples of how Jesus' teachings fly directly in the face of conventional quote-unquote wisdom. And if we were to go through all of them, we'd be here all day, which none of us want. So, suffice it to say, living in this way, as Jesus warns, will create some friction, some tension, some conflict. I know, for all my fellow conflict-averse people out there, I wish it were not so, and yet it is. So the question then becomes, if we are set at odds with these other people, be they friends, family members, neighbors, or even complete strangers, what are we supposed to do? Well, I'm pretty sure that Jesus had something to say about how we are called to treat our enemies. We are called to love them, to extend the same grace, forgiveness, and love that we have been offered in and through the person of Jesus. Now, will that be fun and enjoyable to do? Maybe, but probably not. Will they be thankful for it? Again, probably not. But is that still who we are called to be? As followers of the one who shows us a different, countercultural, kingdom-oriented way of being in this world? Absolutely. Even if it ruffles a few feathers, or wins us a few enemies, or causes people to look at us like we are completely out of touch with reality, the wisdom of Jesus will look like foolishness to some, and that's okay. We know who we are called to be. We know how we are called to act, and we know that we will not be alone as we follow where Jesus would lead us. Amen.